Hi, everyone. We're going to talk to you today about the power of the open source community on GitHub. I'm Mike McQuaid. I'm a senior engineer at GitHub, and I work mainly on our open source stuff, trying to make GitHub better for open source people building on GitHub.
Hey, and I'm Fukui. I'm a product designer on the community and safety team at GitHub, and I work on building workflow tools specifically for the open source community.
So we're going to walk you through today a couple of different things. So firstly, what open source software is on GitHub, how to create some inclusive open source communities on GitHub, and how to improve the interactions within those open source communities, whether you're doing so as a user, as a contributor, or a maintainer. So firstly, let's start by having a wee look at what open source software looks like on GitHub. And to do that, we're going to break down the repos that are on GitHub today. So GitHub, you probably saw in Chris's talk earlier, we've got 21 million developers, roughly, today, and roughly about 58 million repositories. So as I'm sure you all know, repositories can be either public, which means anyone can access them, or private, which means they're restricted to a smaller number of users. So within our public repositories, we've got 28 million, roughly, and we consider about 20% of those to be open source projects. We have various metrics we use to decide that, based on the licenses, pull requests, things like that. And I think open source for GitHub is one of our most important attributes, and we really like to kind of talk about and think about what happens with open source projects at scale. Because, as we're going to talk about in this talk, I think there's various interactions in open source communities which are fine on a small scale, but then as projects get bigger and bigger, become potentially problematic, or at least difficult. So here's some examples of 4 open source projects that I think are really, really successful on GitHub. These are all projects that you're probably familiar with in some way, or at least 1 or 2 of them. And as you can see, they're all projects that have had, these numbers may be a little bit out of date now, but all projects that have had huge numbers of commits from a really large number, at least 1,000 contributors for each of these projects. So obviously, when you're a project at these sort of scale, you're going to have different problems to a project that has 10 contributors or hundreds of commits. And I think what makes these projects really special is they're ones that we at GitHub specifically recognize as projects that are welcoming to new contributors, despite the fact that they've got so massive and despite the fact that they're used by millions of people daily to kind of learn how to code, to work on production software systems, and for some people to just mess around and play. So let's have a wee think about what makes a successful open source community. Kat, what do you think?
Good question, Mike. Well, I think the key to success lies in first understanding that open source on GitHub is not just about the software, it's about the people. So how can we scale a single positive interaction in a community such as Rails or Node to up to thousands of people? So let's talk through a typical open source journey on GitHub. So here we go. We've got a developer, and she uploads her code on GitHub, and it starts getting attention. So maybe people on Twitter are talking about it, maybe it starts trending on GitHub, and people are cloning it, forking it, and starring it. So there's this turning point, though, where it becomes from an open source project to a community, and that's when it gets its first issue or pull request for a non-collaborator. So this person might not be in the same time zone, she might not know this person in real life, and that's really exciting. But in order to scale from that point, from that very first issue, you have to think, if I'm doing 1 or 2 bug fixes this week, what if that scales up to 50 issues and 50 pull requests that I need to do code review? At that point, it's really crucial to find repeat contributors. And that's the key to scaling up. You need to find people who are being converted from users to repeat contributors, and contributors that are now turning into maintainers. And those are all positive interactions that creates this community. But on the flip side, there are some not so positive interactions that can happen. So let's go through a journey where that could be possible. So same journey, but she's looking for some repeat contributors. Unfortunately, maybe there was a bad first impression by this new potential contributor. For example, maybe it took a while for her to respond to this person's first issue in PR. If you've ever contributed to open source for the first time, you know that it can be really intimidating, and it doesn't feel that great. Maybe there were some rude interactions, maybe unconstructive criticism on the pull request, and maybe the contributing guidelines weren't well documented, so this pull request wasn't set up for success and ended up being closed out. That also doesn't feel really good. And when you don't have that help to scale your community, that really leads to maintainer burnout a lot of the time, and that also doesn't feel great. So how can we keep encouraging more positive interactions in communities to create more inclusive open source spaces? And right here is a cycle of success that we are really building a framework around at GitHub. And it can determine if a community can scale or not. So it's really important in order to maintain the code, the growth, the documentation, and also the user base. But in order to do that, you need to have sustainable growth, but also have a mechanism to moderate the users that are coming into your project. So if you saw earlier in those examples, there are over 1,000 contributors. At that point, you need to be able to do at every single stage in this cycle. And if there aren't enough resources, a community can really struggle at that point. So with this model in mind, community safety and the open source team at GitHub have been working on a framework to help you build a scalable, inclusive community. So in the maintaining stage, we just released this last week, and it's the Add a Code of Conduct tool to your repository. Ta-da! So for some context, a code of conduct is a document that explains the baseline behaviors and expectations of your project. So here, we have some templates that you can choose from, and it's super, super easy to fill in your information and adopt it right from there, out of the box. And why do we think this is really important for your community? Well, it really helps, first of all, understanding that everyone that contributes has to have a certain behavior, and that we want to foster this really positive social atmosphere. And in the end, it can help reduce the fatigue that maintainers have with dealing with human-to-human interactions. And sometimes, I think it's harder to maintain those human interactions than maintaining code. So here it is in action. Super easy. You fill in your details, choosing a template, and you can open up a pull request so that the community sees this new change. So in the growing stage, not too long ago, we released the first-time contributor badge, and this is a way to put a face to the new community members. And we really want to foster a good first-time experience, though. When a maintainer opens up this new pull request, they'll see this badge and act accordingly. So maybe a little less judgment when reading the code, maybe some hand-holding to welcome them into the community. But then also, it shows the maintainer that they could be reacting in a quicker time. And that way, back to those problems with the potential first-time contributor, they don't feel that their code is being ignored, and they feel like they're welcome into the community. So also Sparkles. Also in the growing stage, we have just released the community profile. This is it. And it's a way to see how your community compares to open source standards. And for the first iteration, we have this awesome checklist that shows you how the community stands up to having a README, a code of conduct, contributing guidelines, and a license. So say you're not sure when's the right time to add a contributing guideline to your community, and maybe you don't know how to write one. We want to be there with you at every step of the way as you're growing. And this was really, that's the reason why we built this. It's because we understand that a community has different needs as it grows, and we want to be there with you to help you build the best community possible. So right now it's in early access beta, but it will be available in the next 2 weeks or so. And another shiny new thing that we've been working on in the moderating stage are the temporary interaction limits. Ta-da! And these are ways to force sort of a cooldown period in your repository. So you can actually limit who is interacting, so commenting, opening up issues, and pull requests. You can limit it to existing users. So in this example right here, say someone has been creating a lot of sock puppet accounts and maybe even spamming or harassing any members on your community. So you can limit it to 2 people who are prior users and preventing people who have just created a new account from interacting with your repository. And even internally at GitHub, because we're actually a remote and asynchronous company, we understand that it's really easy to misunderstand people through a text-based medium completely online. I mean, we're all human, and it happens. So sometimes it's good to restrict who is communicating in the repository to give everyone space, think about it, calm down, come back fresh, and attack it from there. But also dealing with the harassment that sometimes happens in repositories. here's an actions. So you can go to your repository settings, edit them there, and they toggle for every 24 hours. And this is also in early access and will be rolling out in the next week or two. So going back into how all of the new features play into this model of success, we released the Code of Conduct tool to help you maintain your community's expectations and also the interactions from users. We have the community profile and the first-time contributor badge to help you grow your community. And we're giving you new tools to interact, how people interact on your community in the moderating stage. So Mike, what do you think is really important to keep this model of success alive?
I think the thing is, these are all great technical solutions to these problems, but I think to tackle any problems and also make positive interactions in open source communities more likely, you really need to look at both technical and social solutions. And I think the social solutions I'm going to talk through are looking at a different way, perhaps, of interacting with open source projects, whether you're a user, whether you're a contributor, or whether you're a maintainer. I think there's little things you can do, whether you're in any of these groups, and again, you may well find yourself in different groups for different pieces of software. I'm an open source maintainer, but I might just be a user or a contributor for another project. And just things to think about as you have these interactions to make them a little bit more positive. So I'm going to start off by talking about things I think users can do a little bit better. And when I refer to a user here, I mean basically anyone who hasn't been a contributor, i.e. hasn't committed or submitted a pull request ever to that project for code or documentation or whatever, and someone who's not a maintainer, i.e. someone who doesn't have commit access to that project and can't make changes or close issues or whatever. So this is something where I'm interacting with this software primarily because it's something I probably use or my company uses or I'm trying to learn it, and I'm just trying to make sure that that is a positive interaction. So I think the first thing is setting your expectations accordingly. I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that a lot of open source projects are run exclusively by volunteers, and a lot of volunteers are doing this exclusively in their free time, using resources that they've managed to get through begging and borrowing or whatever. And as a result, I think you need to set your expectations going in on open source projects to be according to the resources and funding that that project has. Okay, that might not be that obvious, and as a result, if you just set them maybe a little bit lower than you might do for a commercial project of the same level, I think that's reasonable. When I say expectations, I don't mean the quality of the software, but I mean the quality of perhaps the support experience you get. For example, Homebrew, which is a project I work on, I'm one of the maintainers for that, we're entirely run by volunteers. So when someone comes along and is using Homebrew to do their job, I understand that it can be quite frustrating for them if Homebrew doesn't work the way they want. But at the same time, when I'm answering their messages at 9 p.m. in my evening after a full day's work, I'm not going to be able to give quite the amount of time and energy to that I might be able to give where it's something that's part of my job. So then the next thing that kind of relates to the prior one is everyone just helping out however they can. So if you use a piece of software for a non-trivial amount of time, then you're going to become more knowledgeable than someone who just used it on day one. So I think, again, another good thing with open source to think about is everyone is capable of helping out. You may not be able to spend lots of time doing things, you may not be able to spend lots of effort or whatever, but if you go and if you need help from someone else, if you need help from the open source project, then you notice while you're doing that there's someone else who needs help and there's someone else who has a question that you could maybe answer, then I would really encourage you to think about doing that. I think it's a really great thing about open source communities because these interactions are in the open, that if I'm asleep and I can't answer a question for someone because of that someone else in the community can go and come and help them and answer their question maybe before I woke up. And even within that as well, sometimes, if you do this in a considerate and careful and, I guess, an empathetic way, trying to encourage people to have more positive interactions themselves. So someone might submit a bug report. I'm sure if you're a software developer, you've seen one of these, and the bug report is more or less, this doesn't work. I tried to do it, and it doesn't work. That doesn't give me enough information I need to fix that problem. So if you're another user who also runs into the same problem, you might want to say to the first user, hey, could you describe the situation in which this doesn't work? Or you could yourself provide a series of, I guess, step-by-step commands so that when someone does wake up, when someone is able to spend that time helping you, then they can immediately jump in and be more productive immediately. And that ties on to the next point, which is prioritizing the time of contributors and maintainers. So in an open source project, for example, like the ones we saw before, where you have thousands of contributors, you have millions of users in many cases, and maintainers in some cases with some of these projects, there may only be single or double digits worth of maintainers. So as a result, not every maintainer can help every user with every issue they have. And as a result, if you're expecting help from people, then you need to try and do a little bit of the homework yourself, do some of the legwork, maybe go and say, okay, here's what I've tried already to fix my problem, here's what I looked, here's what my kind of inkling on what the problem might be. Because again, all these things, they just help to mean that someone else is able to solve your problem quicker. So although all these user interactions might sound a little bit like compromises or something, or giving up something from yourself for other people, it's worth bearing in mind that open source software is generally developed for free and given to you kind of as is. So these interactions just mean that you and the project as a whole can have a better experience, because every hour that a maintainer spends helping someone with their problem is an hour they're not spending writing a bug fix. And while both are important, it's important to help people with support issues and to write code to fix problems. Obviously, balancing that time effectively is something I think everyone in the open source community can help with, rather than just maintainers. So moving on to contributors now. As I mentioned before, I consider a contributor to be anyone who has at least attempted to submit a commit or a pull request or to a project. So I think the thing with contributor interactions is that we're trying to think about how can we get our stuff accepted if it's kind of desirable to the project, and if it's useful to us and it's useful to them. What can we do to maximize our chances of success, and also, again, consider the time of everyone who's working on it. So a good starting point is just make sure you kind of read and follow the project guidelines. In general, we have, in software development as a whole, issues with sometimes not writing as much good documentation as we should, and equally, I think we have issues, I know I'm guilty of this sometimes, of not reading all the documentation. I mean, you only need to read online about the problems people have with assembling IKEA furniture to know that sometimes reading the manual is not always the first thing that jumps to mind. So when you're contributing to an open source project, some projects don't have a lot, some projects do have a lot, but try and at least read everything that's available to you. Projects now on GitHub have issue templates, pull request templates. There's a contributing.md file in most repositories. And just try and make sure you've read through them and follow all the steps. If you're someone who's contributed before, try and make sure that you just double check that that hasn't changed, that there's been no process changes or whatever. And again, this is just about helping yourself to maximize the chances of success, and also helping prioritize the time. Someone else took the time to write that documentation, so it's probably beneficial to you if you take the time to read through it as well. The next thing is deferring to maintainers. Now, that sounds a little bit weird, but what I'm trying to say here is not that maintainers are always right or anything like that. But what I'm trying to say here is that there will reach a point in any, perhaps, conversation on an open source project where a contributor and a maintainer are arguing on whether a feature should be in a project or not in a project or whatever. And at the end of the day, you need to accept that the maintainers are the ones who, for better or for worse, are running the project on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, all conversations will reach a point where if a maintainer says, look, this is kind of how it is, this way or this way, hopefully you can kind of give them a certain amount of deference that you can say, well, okay, you're running this project, I may disagree with you on this instance perhaps, but I'm going to kind of defer to your knowledge on this and hopefully kind of have a positive interaction with that way anyway. And the final thing I would encourage contributors, although this applies to users as well, is stepping outside of your comfort zone. So to share a personal anecdote, so I guess it was about 8 years ago now, I kind of was dabbling with the Homebrew project, and I kind of knew a guy who worked on it and stuff like that, and I was kind of trying to suggest some stuff to him to say, hey, maybe it would be better with this or that or the other. And he kind of poked me to say, okay, well, maybe you should go and submit a pull request. And I said, well, I've never written any Ruby before, I don't know any Ruby or whatever. And then you fast forward a few years later, and now I'm one of the Homebrew maintainers, and I write Ruby mainly as my job. The way I learned Ruby is through open source and through contributing to Homebrew originally. And I think that sense of allowing yourself to be nudged a little bit outside your comfort zone is really useful, both to the project, because you're able to help out. If I had done other programming in the past, so I was able to write some fairly horrendous Ruby that, although terrible, was still useful to the project in some ways, and I'm able to kind of understand stuff and learn from that and get better. And that learning process has made me better for Homebrew, and it's also made my career better, and it's made me kind of better for future employers as well. So I think it's beneficial to everyone to try and take that step outside your comfort zone. So then stepping on to maintainers. So maintainers, as I said before, that's someone who has commit access to a project, who has permissions to close issues, close PRs, stuff like that, can block people on the project, whatever. So the first thing I think as a maintainer to bear in mind, and this is the stuff that I care pretty deeply about. We're running an event tomorrow for some GitHub maintainers, and if you want to talk to me about any stuff relating to maintaining specifically, please email me at any time. The first thing I think is really important is like self-care and avoiding burnout. Being an open source maintainer can sometimes be quite stressful. It can occupy an awful lot of your time and an awful lot of your headspace sometimes. And I think part of dealing with that is recognizing a couple of things. Firstly, an open source project without any maintainers anymore is basically dead. You know, it may be like a tree that has died that from the outside, like, it looks okay, but like it's going to rot and it's going to fall over eventually. So as a result, you need to prioritize yourself and your needs as a maintainer on an open source project above those of contributors or users. Again, that sounds harsh, but that's the realistic reality of open source projects. An open source project with no maintainers cannot receive any future development, cannot accept any pull requests, and will eventually fall over. So on a personal level, what that tends to look like is figuring out that you can opt out of things you may not want to do in a project, that you can say no to features, to helping particular use cases, to supporting certain ways of using your project that you may not want to deal with. And again, it's remembering that unless you are someone who is paid to do this and you're doing open source as some sort of commercial enterprise, like, that's okay. Like, your project exists on your terms and your interactions with your users exist on your terms. So it's important to realize and set those boundaries. The next thing I think is acting as a force multiplier. Again, stepping back to the example I said before I'd ever worked on Homebrew, and that guy nudged me, okay, we'll try and learn some Ruby, try and do this. So he could have sat down with me every step of the way and tried to kind of walk me through all this stuff, but that wouldn't have actually been the best use of his time. So what I think Homebrew and many other projects are increasingly finding is really beneficial is to try and write tooling, write good documentation and stuff like that, and automation as a maintainer so that you can ensure that contributors don't have to get handheld through every step of the process, but they can have like CI, they can have little checks like Rubicop, whatever, like that kind of guide them in the right direction. And the other fun little fact I found personally on this as well is that people respond way better to bots telling them like to change stuff than they do humans. People are fine with pedantic bots, whereas people don't like pedantic humans very much. And then finally, I think it's considering how all your changes within a project affect 90% of users. So that's just a number I've pulled out the top of my head. But I think, again, with an open source project, it's very easy to get kind of stuck in the details on a particular pull request. And someone's maybe put a lot of time into a pull request, and you feel kind of bad, maybe, about not merging it or about not accepting it. But I think, for me, this is the thing I always come back to, is like, how is this feature going to affect 90% of users? And if this is a feature that's going to be used by 5%, 1%, 0.1% of users of this project, but if that's, you know, a massive code change, say, or a massive refactoring underneath it or whatever, that's going to have consequences. That's going to have its own bugs. It's going to have time that you're going to have to spend maintaining this stuff. And as a result, for 90% of your users, it may be that merging this pull request is a bad idea. It's not the right thing to do here. So I think thinking about this thing in general, when you're kind of thinking about every pull request, every issue, thinking about, is this the best use of my time to kind of help the majority of people using my project? That can help you to set better boundaries. That can help you to kind of prioritize the things that are really important. And again, that can help you. The force multiplier thing is a great example of that, because if I spend my time working on an open source project on tooling, on documentation, to empower other contributors to do things, then that in turn expands out to mean that they are able to help themselves, they are able to help their users, and they are able to maybe one day become maintainers themselves as well. So that's like a little brief walkthrough of some of the ways I think that are beneficial with open source projects to kind of interact better. Obviously, you could talk about this for days. I do. But I would really recommend you go and look, if you haven't already seen, opensource.guide. This is a website that kind of GitHub released with help from the community, help from, I think, maintainers on most of, if not all of, the open source projects I mentioned earlier, on just thinking about, like, how do you do open source? What are, you can see in the top left, you've got kind of the most, kind of starting from kind of some basic things of, like, how do you even contribute to open source? If you're someone who's never done it before, okay, there's guides on how to create a pull request and stuff like that, but like, how do you find a project that you want to work on? And thinking through these types of problems, and we've tried to make it this documentation so that people can go and learn about this stuff. And also, at a higher level, like how do you maintain successful open source projects? What are some of the legal issues maybe around open source? And things like how do you like find financing and sponsorship for your open source project? These are all things that are within these guides. And the other cool thing about the guides is they are themselves an open source project. If you click through, if you scroll to, I think it's at the bottom of the page, you can click through to the GitHub repository. People are submitting pull requests there. I think in the last couple of days, someone submitted a Spanish translation of the entire set of the guides. So it's kind of cool to see these documents evolving, and it means that unlike if we published this in a book or like as some static site that was just maintained exclusively by people from GitHub, this document's going to evolve as the best practices in open source change and as GitHub itself changes. And I really encourage you, as I say, to check them out. And if you have wisdom in there that isn't already there, please submit as a pull request.
It's also really beautiful and easy to navigate, so please check it out.
So yeah, so today we've kind of talked about a couple of things. So I'm going to give you a wee overview of like what is the open source that's on GitHub and stuff like that. Talking about how you can kind of create successful open source communities and how you can improve those interactions. Kat walked through various of the features we've added to GitHub to try and make it easier for you to have those positive interactions in open source communities. And then I kind of talked through a little bit about, for users, contributors, and maintainers, what are the best ways to interact on open source communities. And I just wanted to say, if you have any other thoughts on this stuff, as I say, submit a pull request to the open source guides, or feel free to ask us any questions. Afterwards, we'll be kind of hanging around Satellite today, or on that's our Twitter accounts. Feel free to hit us up that way.
Yep. I think we're both really excited about building a framework that can help the future of communities on GitHub. So please, if you have any other suggestions or talk about your own community experiences, talk about that, and add us on Twitter.
Thank you.